You know, there's a connection, of course, between Tolkien and Corpus Christi College, which is that his dear friend Geoffrey Bache Smith was an undergraduate here shortly before the First World War. And in fact, Tolkien wrote his earliest published piece of literary critical writing on the Finnish national epic, the Kalevala, for a talk he was giving here to the Sundial Society at the invitation of G.B. Smith, who was elected president of the Sundial Society at that very same meeting, 22nd of November 1914, just a week before deciding to join the army. This was the start of the First World War. So he applied for a commission in the British Army. Smith was really deeply central to Tolkien's early creative thinking. Humphrey Carpenter says that it was Smith that persuaded Tolkien to try poetry. And he also says, quote, he had shown the original Earendel lines to G.B. Smith. So Tolkien had just in September written his poem, The Voyage of Earendel, Evening Star. And Smith had said that he liked them, but asked what they were really about. Tolkien had replied, I don't know, I'll try to find out. And there you can see is the beginning of everything, the reason we're here, Smith's question. 2 years later, from the trenches, Smith writes to Tolkien that he is a wild and wholehearted admirer of everything Tolkien has so far written, poetry essentially, but also I'm sure of the burgeoning ideas that he had heard Tolkien talking about, of this mythology that he has in mind. But Smith died that same year, that December, of wounds on the battlefield of the Somme. Not 50 years ago, as it should have been perhaps, but 107 years ago. He was a very young man. And therefore he never saw the start of Tolkien's prose mythology, the Book of Lost Tales, the thing we now know as the Silmarillion, which Tolkien began the month after Smith died. And I'm pretty sure that Tolkien partly was impelled to get on with it because of his deep consciousness of mortality at that point, but also his consciousness that he owed so much to his late friend. Tolkien's first published book was Smith's A Spring Harvest, a posthumous collection of poetry, and the subject of the conference here, organised by Giuseppe, about Smith and Tolkien. It was a fabulous event. Now, Tolkien's own work turned out to be not a spring harvest, a harvest of the few things that one can gather in the spring that are edible, but a rich autumn feast with The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And yet, nonetheless, like G.B. Smith, Tolkien died before a vast amount of his own writings saw the light and were published in the form of the Silmarillion, principally, and the History of Middle-earth, edited by Christopher Tolkien. So, that's the slide that was meant to accompany all of that. Tolkien as a young man, and here we are, Corpus Christi. To Tolkien and my theme. He said, writing in 1958, that photograph is 1961, so you can see you can just about imagine him saying this. I object to the contemporary trend in criticism with its excessive interest in the details of the lives of authors and artists. They only distract attention from an author's works, and in the end, as one now often sees, in becoming the main interest. that only one's guardian angel, or indeed God himself, could unravel real relationship between personal facts and an author's works. There are quite a few other things Tolkien said about biography, literary biography, and as my title suggests, at one point he calls it an entirely vain and false approach. Now, taking a biographical approach to tackling these objections, I would say that they are a sign of the times and a sign of Tolkien's particular standpoint. So, for a start, Tolkien was a medievalist, dealing with a corpus of works that very rarely had an identifiable author. So that meant that biographical criticism was virtually impossible for him in his field. You see him at times trying to imagine what the Beowulf poet was like as a person, but essentially the way he's doing that is extracting the person from Beowulf itself, projecting from that poem. That's not what literary biography does, or at least it's not the only thing that literary biography must do. One issue with Tolkien, of course, and again, this is what biography can reveal, his attitudes shifted throughout his life. We don't actually have very much information about his views before he was 45, which is when the letters in the published collection of letters, edited by Humphrey Carpenter with Christopher Tolkien, really gets underway, the time that The Hobbit was being prepared for publication. So we don't really see much about Tolkien as a man unaffected by a sense of the public stage, a sense of being an author that people might become interested in. And later on, he became very much bothered by his fame. As we know, he actually left Oxford for Bournemouth in the 1960s in order to escape constant intrusions. He also suffered from misunderstandings and laziness on the part of early commentators who tried to take a biographical approach. One of them was the translator of the Swedish Lord of the Rings, Aka Olmarks, forgive my pronunciation if I have that wrong, who wrote in the introduction about Tolkien reading these books to his children. Bear in mind he's talking about the Lord of the Rings here, in fact. And he says, one can clearly see before one the fireside evenings in the peaceful villa out at Sandfield Road in Headington, near Oxford, with the Barrow Downs or Headington Hills in the rear and the Misty Mountains or the 560 feet high Shotover in the background. And anyone who knows Oxford will know that it's not really very much like that at all. There is only one Headington Hill. There are no standing stones on it, and Shotover may occasionally be misty, but it's really not mountainous. Plus, he wrote the book before he moved out to Headington and never read it to his children. He said, he called this such outrageous nonsense. The book was written before I moved to Headington, which has no hills. Another aspect of Tolkien's dislike of autobiography is no doubt the prevalence, the huge influence of Sigmund Freud during his era. As James Joyce says in Finnegan's Wake, at one time we were young and easily frightened. So I found a wonderful essay by Richard Ellman, great biographer of Joyce, Oscar Wilde, and W.B. Yeats, summing up Freudian biography, Freudian literary criticism, and he lists various issues with it. Reasons why authors didn't like this phenomenon. So, for a start, this kind of biography tries to show that we all have secrets that we don't even know about ourselves. It's very unnerving. Everyone creates symbolic fantasy in their dreams, so there's nothing special about writers. Literary merit itself is irrelevant, and writing is often just a repression of neurosis. So Ellman has this fabulous line: writers fancied they were eagles and are only clams. And one of the problems with all this is that if we reduce literary art or any other art to just a bundle of neuroses, universal sexual tics or whatever, it's a hugely reductive process. So at the end, we arrive at a variety of archetypes or stereotypes rather than individual illuminating portraits. To Freudian critics, the linear past really doesn't matter. What matters is the imaginative past, the past of childhood trauma in particular. And a Freudian reading involves an almost infinite set of possible symbolic substitutions, inversions, suppressions, false facades. So it's like a game of Lego, if you like, which you can move around at will to create more or less what you fancy. There's a huge amount of conjecture in the place of evidence. If you can't see it, says Ellman, it must be there. So Tolkien was aware of this stuff. And that's the end of his quote there about literary biography. It's not possible. Not the author himself can know these things, though he knows more than any investigator, and certainly not so-called psychologists. And he says in the same letter, modern researchers inform me that Beethoven cheated his publishers and abominably ill-treated his nephew, but I don't believe that has anything to do with his music. And one of the pleasures of investigating Tolkien's life is just to go onto the Times, because he was a reader of the Times newspaper, the Times newspaper archive online and find what he's talking about. So here's the thing. He may have had heard about this biography in conversation, of course, but he probably found it also in the Times review section, where this book, Beethoven and His Nephew by E. and R. Sturber, is reviewed positively, I should say. But Freud himself didn't like biography. Anyone turning biographer commits himself to lies, he said, for biographical truth is not to be had, and even if it were, it couldn't be used. I guess he's saying there is that it would be obscene, it would be so private, it would be on the pale. But writers in general, I opened the Oxford Dictionary of Literary Quotations to the section on biography, and virtually every quotation in there is some author moaning about biography. Oscar Wilde, every great man nowadays has his disciples, and it is always Judas who writes the biography. And then more modern author Edmund White, and I love this one. Along comes this petty bourgeois biographer who has a totally uninteresting life, herself or himself, and who tried to measure this giant by their own pygmy standards. Biography is a form by which little people take revenge on big people. So there we have biographer as Bilbo Baggins. Thinking about Tolkien as an artist, as a creative artist, I think we also have to see him as a kind of poker player. he has to keep a straight face. He doesn't want to give away his hand, the tricks of his art. And one of the beautiful biographical facts that I learned in my investigations, it comes from historian Hugh Brogan, who knew Tolkien as a kind of pen pal when Hugh was a young Hobbit fan and would write to Tolkien. And the correspondence became so frequent that when Tolkien visited the Brogans' hometown of Cambridge, he called in to have tea with them, and he performed this astonishing fall down the stairs, arms and legs flying, in Hugh's words, and got up at the bottom, not like North Polar Bear in that picture from the Father Christmas letters there, with a flourish like this. And he was about my age at the time. So you can imagine, I wouldn't dream of doing this kind of thing. So he really was a perfectionist, someone who was prepared to go well beyond the bounds of normal risk, if you like, as an artist, as a performer. And this feeds into Tolkien's own theories about literary creativity. When he talks in his 1939 lecture on fairy stories about creation, divine creation, and what he calls subcreation, the kind of creativity we have as mortals, a successful subcreator makes a secondary world which your mind can enter. Inside it, what he relates is true. It accords with the laws of that world. You therefore believe it while you are, as it were, inside. The moment disbelief arises, the spell is broken. You are then out in the primary world again, looking at the little abortive secondary world from outside. And there's an obvious anxiety about the idea that we are going to look not at the work itself, but at the author. Which brings in Tolkien's friend C.S. Lewis, a major influence on Tolkien's thinking. Whatever Lewis might have thought, he thought Tolkien was uninfluenceable. So Lewis took part in a pioneering debate which was published in a book, 1939, called The Personal Heresy. The debate was between Lewis and Oxford academic E.M.W. Tillyard. I was amused to discover Tillyard's full name, Eustace Mandeville Wettenhall Tillyard. And you have to add, and he almost deserved it. So Lewis said in this debate, Lewis takes the view that literary biography is an entirely vain and false approach. And he puts it very well. To see things as the poet sees them, I must share his consciousness and not attend to it. I must look where he looks and not turn around to face him. I must make of him not a spectacle, but a pair of spectacles. Nonetheless, Lewis himself provided a vital service for his undergraduates at Oxford and later at Cambridge, and posthumously for the rest of us, by writing about the medieval world picture. It's now published as a book, The Discarded Image, and it allows us, in reading medieval literature, to start to understand it as its authors, its audience would have understood it, rather than attempting to fit it into our own preconceptions, our own very vague understanding of medieval thinking. And interestingly, Tillyard is also famous for writing the Elizabethan world picture, a similar kind of book for a slightly later era. So Lewis and Tillyard are actually on the same page in thinking that context is vital, understanding where the author is coming from. You can't replace that. Because, like languages, Tolkien's specialist study, ideas, values, all change. So let's take one very contentious example that comes up with Tolkien, Tolkien and race. Now I've been doing some research in the past few weeks, in fact, springing from Tolkien's comment in 1938 to a German publisher asking him to prove his Aryan credentials in accordance with Nazi law so that they could go ahead and publish The Hobbit. And he says to his publisher, I have many Jewish friends and I'd hate to give any support to this noxious politics. And that's led me to some very interesting thoughts, which I'm not going to share right now because they're still crystallizing. But Tolkien and race, I think if we look at Tolkien and race now, with our own perspectives on race, we will be liable to put him on a trial for which he's incapable of defending himself because he's dead and because the values that he shared or in which he was in dialogue with were different, had shifted around since then. But one little sidelight on Lord of the Rings, which I found when working on my book Worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien, is that whereas we have these big battle scenes where you get frankly fairly offensive descriptions of the enemy from the east and from the south, like from the African lands, let's say, of the Harad, you also get that wonderful scene where Faramir's soldiers ambush the Haradrim from the south and their Oliphaunt. And Sam sees a warrior killed in front of his eyes. And all that Sam feels is empathy for him. He thinks he's come here from somewhere afar, like I have, and doesn't necessarily understand what it's all about. He's just doing what he thinks is right. And the wonderful thing about this stage of Tolkien's writing is that we can, for once, see what was going on in Tolkien's life very closely, because he was sending Book 4 of The Lord of the Rings to Christopher Tolkien, chapter by chapter, along with letters. Christopher was in South Africa at the time, training in the RAF. He was distressed by what he saw of what we might call proto-apartheid, so the treatment of blacks in South Africa. And his father wrote to him, "As for what you say or hint of local conditions, I knew of them," because Tolkien was born there. "I used to hear them discussed by my mother, and have ever since taken a special interest in that part of the world. The treatment of colour nearly always horrifies anyone going out from Britain, and not only in South Africa." So I think it's very likely that Tolkien, knowing that Christopher was his primary audience, or one of two, along with Lewis, for Lord of the Rings at this stage, wrote that scene as a way of answering Christopher about his revulsion over proto-apartheid. In the same 1958 letter that I've been quoting all along, Tolkien goes on to give a very brief autobiographical comment. "I am in fact a hobbit, in all but size. I like gardens, trees and unmechanised farmlands. I smoke a pipe and like good plain food, unrefrigerated, but detest French cooking. I like and even dare to wear in these dull days ornamental waistcoats. I'm fond of mushrooms out of the field, have a very simple sense of humour, go to bed late, get up late. I do not travel much. I love Wales, what is left of it, when mines and even more ghastly seaside resorts have done their worst, and especially the Welsh language. I hope that is enough to go on with." And I think if you pull out some of those phrases, you can see actually there's a lot there about Tolkien's values, and a great deal that places him within his time. this is an era when refrigeration was a fairly novel thing for a start. A bit like maybe microwaves were in the 1980s. Well, I don't trust those. My sister still doesn't trust them. So Tolkien conceded some value to biography, and this kind of autobiographical statement says as much implicitly. He says, "I doubt its relevance to criticism, certainly in any form less than a complete biography, interior and exterior, which I alone could write, and which I do not intend to write." I think the picture has changed, and this is one of the fundamental points. It's changed so much, as Giuseppe was saying. So much has been published on Tolkien since, and we have a wealth of biographical information now coming in from various angles, from the broad, comprehensive approach taken by Scull and Hammond in the Tolkien Companion and Guide, with its enormous chronology, detailed chronology, and from Holly Ordway on Tolkien's faith, for example, or his modern reading, from the Raymond Edwards biography, just titled Tolkien, which sheds a lot of light on his academic life. And we also have access to resources that Tolkien could only have dreamed of, or could never have dreamed of, because many of them are online. The ability for me to find out genealogical information, or glance at what newspaper Tolkien was reading on any given day at my desk would have been literally incredible to Tolkien. Virginia Woolf comes to our aid when she says, "Almost any biographer, if he respects facts, can give us much more than another fact to add to our collection. He can give us the creative fact, the fertile fact, the fact that suggests and engenders," which is why I think a book like the Hammond and Scull Companion and Guide is really, best of all, as a starting point, as a launch pad for further investigation and for synthesis. It's a pointillist portrait, especially that chronology, and you need to stand back and kind of project imaginatively and do further investigation to fill the picture out. There is, of course, suspicion of biographers as a kind of journalist, a snoop, a scandalmonger. There we are. And there's me in my reporting days interviewing. I don't know, anyone recognise that woman I'm interviewing? Sue Barker, tennis ace and later ace commentator. So I wasn't actually much of a snoop as a journalist. I didn't last very long at that. I didn't like the idea of, for example, going and knocking on someone's door when they just had a bereavement. That was expected of you in those days. I believe in the value of journalism to bear witness to events, to demystify complexities, and to investigate. These things tend to be overlooked more and more these days with the animus against so-called mainstream media. But it was one of the ways that I learned the tools of my trade, tools that I use in researching literary biography. I went to a journalism school where they taught us to what they called cone out. Ask your questions, go along the apple tree branch and pick all the apples, each branch. And you will find some are rich, some are bare. But you've got to do that investigation. You've got to be rigorous, thorough. Use your nose, in a sense, to use your imagination to follow what seems to be of value. A further thing that I was then engaged in my spare time was family history research, and that taught me use of archives and patience. Patience especially, because in those days, before I could go online to Ancestry.com and find out, all the Garths in Leeds in the 19th century. I literally spent days or weeks looking at microfilms and leafing through huge volumes, handwritten volumes. Tolkien's theme is creativity. And Gandalf shares my desires here. He talks about what he'd do if he felt free to use the Palantir, the seeing stone. He would look across the wide seas of water and of time to Tirion the Fair and perceive the unimaginable hand and eye of Feanor at their work, while both the white tree and the golden were in flower. We don't have a Palantir. We don't have a time-travelling, fly-on-the-wall drone. But we have vast resources. Tolkien himself was tempted by this kind of investigation. So John Bowers, in his book Tolkien's Lost Chaucer, about Tolkien's work for the Clarendon Press in Oxford to produce a student edition of Chaucer, never published, never completed. John Bowers finds Tolkien looking for evidence for when Chaucer encountered Northern English dialect, Yorkshire dialect, as used in the Reeves Tale and the Canterbury Tales. And he establishes that Chaucer visited Hatfield House in South Yorkshire. But the process of artistic creation is itself fascinating. Christopher Tolkien agreed with that, and that's why we have the history of Middle-earth. A way of looking at Tolkien's Legendarium not as a finished artifact, but as process. And I think the history of Middle-earth is the best justification there can be for literary biography now, because it's almost unique, I think, within literary record for one author's work to receive that kind of attention in terms of its development. Aided by the fact, of course, that Tolkien's own creative endeavours were very unique in themselves. Now I'm running, how much time do I have?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay, I'll have to skip some. There are references in the Legendarium which demonstrate that, especially at first, Tolkien would refer to himself, his family, and places that mattered to him in his mythology. So, for example, in the Book of Lost Tales, he had the lonely Isle of the Elves, Tol Eressëa, was the island of Britain. And he had an imaginary history where places important to Tolkien himself, Warwick, Oxford, and Great Haywood, where Edith Tolkien lived, had elvish prehistories. There is some evidence that this kind of thinking persisted a little bit in Tolkien's later writings. So, for example, when Tolkien first named Fornost in Lord of the Rings, the old capital of the kings in the north, he called it, Fornost is Sindarin or Noldorin for North Fortress. He gave it a different elvish name with the same meaning, Osfrod, Oxford, right? And Tolkien strongly rejected the idea that Hobbiton was inspired by North Oxford and said, no, actually, it's a Warwickshire village at about the time of the Diamond Jubilee. In other words, it's where I grew up as a child. We all know, of course, the Beren and Luthien story and how central that was to Tolkien, and we can see that Tolkien was prepared to commit himself autobiographically to his work so much that he would put those names on the gravestone that he shares with his wife. curious little finding I had while researching at the Bodleian recently. While waiting for some manuscript papers, I wandered over to the place names section and picked up the book, The Place Names of Oxfordshire, 1912, and there was an entry, Berens Hill. I'd never seen the name Beren before, except in Tolkien, and still haven't. So there's a hill near a little village called Ipsden in Oxfordshire. It's in that place names book that Tolkien would have had access to and would have had interest in at the time of his first imaginings of the Book of Lost Tales. So Beren comes in the tale of Tinuviel, written in 1917, 5 years after this. But there's more, because Tolkien had a personal connection with Ipsden in that his friend, Father Vincent Reed from the Birmingham Oratory, colleague of Tolkien's guardian, Father Francis Morgan, came from the family, the main family of Ipsden. They lived in the family seat, the Reed family seat was at Ipsden. And I'm pretty sure that Tolkien would have visited because he was friends with the family. It's also very near the Oratory School at Caversham, which Tolkien was connected with. So I'm wondering, is there some kind of lost tale there? Why did this place matter to Tolkien, or was it just the sound of the name that appealed to him? That's the kind of hypothesis that I think I personally find particularly interesting if there are supporting biographical facts that suggest that it's worth taking seriously. So the date of publication of the book, the nearness of the location, the personal connection with the location, all lend some support to the idea, I think, that Tolkien knew of this place. By contrast, we get people who will swear, for example, that everything I say in the worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien is nonsense because everything in Middle-earth is inspired by the Ribble Valley in Lancashire, right? Or the Burren in Ireland, and yet just a cursory glance at Tolkien's chronology, the timescale of his life, shows that although he visited these places, it was far too late for them to influence The Lord of the Rings. You want to stop there?
Yep. Some final words as you wish.
Yeah. So, what can I say? I hope that the work I've done, and I believe that the work that other people have done, such as Holly, enriches our view of Tolkien, our understanding of him, by providing context. And from that, we can stop seeing him as the poker player Tolkien wanted to be seen, as a man separate from his time, producing a timeless work. We can start recognising him as a man who engaged with his time. So my investigations into the inspirations of the story of the Fall of Númenor, for example, draw very closely on what was going on at the time of writing, the mid-1930s collapse of the post-war peace, the rise of totalitarianism, the approach of war. It allows me to take a more nuanced view of the idea that Sauron represents something in the real world. So Tolkien hated this idea. He hated the idea that people were pinning Sauron down as, let's say, Stalin, because the Lord of the Rings came out during the Cold War. Right? I think it's very clear that when Tolkien's describing Sauron in The Lost Road, his 1937 story about Númenor, he's thinking of totalitarians, definitely, but not necessarily any particular one of them. That Sauron is a grab bag. Furthermore, I think you can project backwards from there to see that Tolkien's also thinking about the Tudor Reformation and there's a hint of Thomas Cromwell, the destroyer of the Catholic Church, in the Sauron of the Lost Road. There's a pitfall, of course, for biography, which is that new facts can overthrow old understandings. And my work at the moment is engaged in trying to demolish the final chapter of my first book, Tolkien and the Great War, because I've discovered that Tolkien misremembered the chronology of when he wrote the creation myth that opens the Book of Lost Tales. Right? He remembered writing it in Oxford around 1919, after the First World War was over. I've established by manuscript evidence that he wrote it in 1917, when he was straight back from the Battle of the Somme. That really illuminates what's going on in that creation myth, in terms of this is the work of someone who's just come from the worst battle that the world's ever seen, and wants to understand why the world is the way it is. But as I say, it's a work in progress. So just like what we're focusing on, biography is process. Thank you.